Welcome, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Matt Rojansky. I'm director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. I want to thank you again for joining us for today's event, Ukraine's Economic Development, a 30-year history. Before we start, I want to remind you, you can stay up to date with upcoming events and publications on our website, as well as by following our podcasts, Kennan X and the Russia File, as well as our Russia File blog and our Focus Ukraine blog. We're very pleased today to have several wonderful experts on Ukrainian and Eurasian economics and energy issues. Each of the speakers that you'll hear from was involved as a contributor to a forthcoming publication, which I can hold up for you if the camera will let me. There we go. Yeah, okay. You can see it. It is entitled From the Ukraine to Ukraine, A Contemporary History. The book explores the multidimensional transformation of independent Ukraine over the past 3 decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It looks at Ukraine's politics, society, private sector, identity, arts, religions, media, and democracy. And we'll currently plan on doing a book launch for that in May. You can pre-order it through the IBIDEM website. Definitely encourage you to take a look at the volume. Our hope is that it is a valuable teaching tool, that it's a backgrounder for journalists, policymakers, diplomats, anybody who's dealing with modern Ukraine from the outside. And it is one of the rare contemporary histories of Ukraine in the English language. We think it stands up very well. Today, we're going to take just a small slice of the book, talking about a few of the essential ideas, including Ukraine's challenge of essentially developing a private sector from nothing in the course of a few years following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Challenges related to privatization, which of course are still ongoing today, and the difficult history of the energy sector in Ukraine, which, as we know, has been a font of corruption and dysfunction, but also potentially promises to be a big part of Ukraine's transformation in the future. And finally, the lessons from both the chapters on the energy sector and Ukraine's private sector more generally, that show us that it is not only the state, but in fact the nation, the building of which leads to the country's success. And I'm very pleased to have not only the authors of those chapters, but my co-editor of the volume, Misha Minakov, with us to lead a discussion, and we have plenty of time to do that. You're welcome to seed questions at any time, including right now, by emailing them to Kennan, Kennan at wilsoncenter.org, tweeting them at Kennan Institute, or posting on our Facebook page. If you include your name and affiliation, that would help me very much when I identify you as the questioner. Now let me start by introducing our first speaker, and I'll just introduce each one in turn before they speak. Andrian Prokip is a senior associate on Ukraine with the Kennan Institute. He's a former Fulbright Kennan Institute research scholar and is currently serving as an energy expert for the Ukrainian Institute for the Future in Kyiv. He is the author of 4 books and many articles and reports on the geopolitics of energy in Europe, the transition to sustainable energy security, and the spatial usage of renewable energy sources. In 2013, he won the Ukrainian Energy Security Strategy Project and is also a member of the Younger Generation Task Force on Euro-Atlantic Security. He has more than a decade's experience teaching and conducting research in both Ukraine and the United States. And Andrian, without any further delay, the floor is yours. You're muted, Andrian.
Thank you, Matt, for this kind introduction. Thank you, everyone, for joining this event. Actually, there was a pretty difficult task for me and Margarita to cover development of Ukrainian energy during this independence period in one chapter. However, I hope we were successful. And I will try to tell you this story very briefly in 7 or 10 minutes to kick off questions for Q&A. And this story of Ukrainian energy during independence period, it was a story of swinging between populism and paternalism on the one side, and attempts to conduct reforms to make sector efficient on the other side. It was a story of swinging between Russia and West, story of swinging between oligarchs' interests. And during recent 30 years, Ukraine received many lessons in energy security and energy policy, but most of these lessons were based on mistakes that Ukraine did itself. And as I see it, key enemies of energy reforms in Ukraine, those were populism, paternalism, and oligarchy consensus. Ukrainian energy sector 30 years ago in 1991 and today, these are completely different in terms of ownership and management, but these are still very similar in terms of energies we used and pattern of energy balance, self-sufficiency, energy intensity, energy efficiency, and the role of oligarchs. 1991 was the year of peak energy demand and consumption in Ukraine ever. And consequently, there was a peak of energy production. But economic crisis that followed the dissolution of Soviet Union was followed with decreased, with falling demand for energy. However, production has fallen as well, and this didn't help Ukraine in energy self-sufficiency. So never by now Ukraine was energy self-sufficient. It was reliant on energy supplies, which implicated in many cases the political dependence and economic dependence. Just two examples, a coal story. Coal was the only one resource that Ukraine had enough, but when military conflict at Donbass started, which is the key coal region in Ukraine, Ukraine was urged to import this resource. But I think Margarita, my colleague, will tell much more about coal. Another story was gas. Between 1991 and 1995, domestic gas production has fallen seriously, and since that moment remained almost the same. By now, and still Ukraine is importing natural gas. However, Ukraine has one of the biggest gas reserves in Europe. And none of these state programs which stipulated boost of gas production didn't help because of plenty of reasons. However, there were also good examples and good stories. For instance, in the area of energy independence, that was a story of diversification of nuclear fuel supplies. By 2014, that was only Russia who supplied nuclear fuel to Ukraine, and since that moment, US Westinghouse became an important player. That was a story of gas independence when in 2014, Ukraine was relying also on European Union as a part of supply, and since late 2015, Ukraine wasn't dependent on Russia as a single supplier. And sure, that is a story of Stockholm arbitration when Ukraine won arbitration claims from Gazprom. Renewables, that is a story that on the one hand could contribute to energy self-sufficiency. However, that is not so good. Renewables started in Ukraine in 2009. At that moment, there was just a business for oligarchs. Market was closed. In 2014, Parliament amended legislation, and any party could join renewable energy business. But misregulation has brought to the problem that today state doesn't have enough money to pay a feed-in tariff to renewable producers, which caused a serious investment crisis, financial crisis in energy, and what I can say also image crisis. Pricing for final consumers is still unfinished business. When Ukraine became independent in 1991, there was no understanding that since that moment, another state, Russia, was supplying energy resources, and Ukraine had to pay for this. So it took so many time to understand that consumers have to pay a real price. In 2010, when Viktor Yanukovych took the cabinet, Ukraine joined European energy community, and hence it had to implement all European energy legislation. However, and this also included establishing real energy prices. However, nothing was done, and liberalization market reform started only in 2014. So by that moment, paternalism was dominant. And what is a paradox that people demanded from government to have to provide low prices, but at the same time, people didn't trust the government when government tried to conduct some reforms and changes in energy. In 2015, new gas market design was introduced, and by now, so we have almost liberalized gas market with however some over-regulations, but I hope that this will be lifted this year. And in 2019, electricity market reform was put in force, and new market design, the same as the European Union, was introduced. However, again, over-regulated, and again, households do not pay the price that cover real cost of energy. At final extent, all these over-regulations and paternalistic behaviors, they brought us to serious financial problems in energy sector. Last year was a real crisis for Ukrainian energy companies. Most of big energy companies were unprofitable. There were serious problems with paying feed-in tariffs to renewable producers, and again there was a serious professionals problem. More than a year, Ukraine doesn't have energy minister, and I don't have only acting ministers, and I don't even mention about other positions in energy sector. And energy intensity, Ukraine is among the global leaders of energy-hungry economies. And sure, shadow economy impacts on this, and the big share of energy-hungry industries in GDP impact on this. But still, enhancing energy efficiency is unfinished business, and so many has to be done in future. So there are so many problems in 2020, 30 years after Ukraine became independent. So we managed to solve some problems that we had 30 years ago, but new problems occurred as a result of misregulation. And these have to be solved in the nearest future to support energy, because energy sector is an important part of economy and political life as well. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Andrian. I'm going to go next to Dr. Marguerita Balmaceda, who is a professor of diplomacy and international relations at Seton Hall University. She is also the Petro Yasik Distinguished Fellow in Ukrainian Studies at Harvard's Ukrainian Research Institute. She's a former Wilson Center Fellow, of course, and is a specialist on comparative energy politics in the post-Soviet states. Her research follows the complex web of interconnections that accompany the energy relationship between Russian oil and gas producers, post-Soviet transit states like Ukraine, and European consumers. Supported by, among others, 3 Fulbright grants and a Marie Curie Fellowship from the European Union, she's conducted extensive field research throughout Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Her books are Russian Energy Chains, the remaking of technopolitics from Siberia to Ukraine to the European Union, resulted from her work as a Woodrow Wilson Fellow, and it is due out in May as part of the Wilson Center series at Columbia University. Her bachelor's is from Johns Hopkins University, and her MA and PhD in politics are from Princeton. Margarita, please.
Thank you, Matt. It's really a pleasure to be here. First of all, because the work we did together with Andrian in this very unique project from the Ukraine to Ukraine was so enriching. The idea of putting together a Western scholar with a Ukrainian scholar led to so much learning, at least on my part, that I really appreciate being able to share this insights also with the larger public today. And I'm also really pleased to be connected to Kennan and to see the work I did with the Wilson Center and Kennan come to fruition in this book that is coming out very soon. So when I was thinking about my remarks for today, as an organizational device, I used the heading, "What have I learned from coal?" And in fact, it was through my stay at the Wilson Center, through my work on this book, that I learned a little bit more about coal, a lot about coal. And what I want to do in the next 5 minutes is to give you a little bit of a sense of why looking at coal can help us understand not only Ukraine's energy situation, but also political development more generally. And certainly speaking about coal is not something we do very often. In fact, I didn't even deal with coal in 3 of my books. And we don't talk about coal very often because it's really not sexy. It doesn't lend itself to the kind of big strategy discussions we have, or the idea of a Russian Gazprom bureaucrat closing the gas pipe. We often think it's out of the picture because we are moving to a clean, decarbonized world. But the reality is that coal is, in places like Ukraine, still very much part of the picture. It's very much part of the picture as part of the energy mix. But even most importantly, and this is what I learned through my Wilson Center and Kennan project, it's part of the picture because it's set into motion a number of tendencies, a number of impulses that are still very much with Ukraine today. So I just want to give you a sense of some of the things that looking at coal can teach us. And obviously I cannot go in detail about this, but I think they're worth thinking about. The first thing that looking at coal teaches us is that not all energy sources are equal. It's very different when we talk about natural gas or oil or coal or nuclear energy, because for a variety of reasons, in my own understanding and in my own theorizing about the question, because of the materiality and physical characteristics of these types of energy, they cannot be used in the same way. In the book that I'm about to publish, I go in great detail about this, and I explain how the physical characteristics of natural gas, for example, as opposed to a liquid type of energy like crude oil, as opposed to coal, which is a bulk product, matter tremendously for the ways in which not only Russia could deploy them against Ukraine, but also matter in terms of the way actors within Ukraine may use them. So that's the first thing we learn about coal, and I will go in more in detail about that in a moment. Through looking at coal, I also understood how tremendously important the first 2-3 years of Ukraine's independence were in terms of setting into motion a set of dynamics that would continue for 30 years. We can talk about these early formative periods also when we talk about natural gas or oil, but in the case of coal, it's especially significant for a number of reasons. First, in the case of coal, we see the most direct clash between, for example, the Ukrainian experience of reform of the coal sector and what neighbors were doing in Poland, in Russia, elsewhere. Whereas in Russia, pretty early in the 1990s, there was an attempt to close unprofitable mines, for example. In Ukraine, none of this happened, and to have a sector of the economy where you have 500,000 people working that is producing or related to 2% of your GDP and not really engage in reform had a tremendous impact on the sector. Everybody in the early 1990s was looking at coal. The World Bank was looking at coal, was trying to give Ukraine ideas and incentives for reforming the sector. Ukrainian politicians were looking at the coal sector, but from a very different perspective. They were interested in the possibility of coal compensating for dependency on Russia in terms of oil or natural gas. But most importantly, they were thinking, how can we keep employment in the sector alive? So really a clash of visions on reform in the sector. And I think in the case of coal, we see that much more starkly than even in the case of natural gas or oil. The third reason why looking at coal can teach us a lot is because it teaches us that energy is not simply about energy as electricity that you may produce from coal. Energy is part of a larger set of industrial supply chains, value chains, which are important for a variety of sectors in the economy, but which can also be manipulated by exactly some of the actors and political tendencies Andrian was talking about a moment ago. What was and what continues to be really unique concerning coal here is that even more than in the case of natural gas or oil, coal is central to two very important value chains for Ukraine. So it is central for the value chain that is coal to electricity. And we know that historically, Ukraine has had a very significant part of its electricity produced by coal. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But it is also significant for another value chain, which actually has been tremendously important for Ukraine in the last 30 years, the metallurgical value chain, the steel value chain. And what this means is that this also allowed, or rather, this also gave incentives for players that may want to benefit or manipulate coal, even more incentives to engage in corruption, to engage in bending of regulations or creation of regulations for their own power. And actually what we saw is that because those supply chains that had been so important for Ukraine in the early before the early 1990s, supply chains related to the entire Soviet system, in particular steel value chains, as these chains are broken, this creates an opportunity for a new set of actors to come in, somehow repair those value chains and supply chains in a very unique way, let's put it that way, and in the process make a tremendous profit through this. And it is exactly during this formative period that we see the rise of what basically became the most important oligarchic actor in Ukraine in the entire post-independence period, which is Renat Achnetov. And as soon as we mention his name, of course, we understand that the importance of coal has not simply been as a contribution to the Ukrainian energy mix, but that the ability of actors such as Achnetov and others to control the sector also gave them a unique, if I may say, blackmailing power on the Ukrainian polity as a whole. That blackmailing power had to do with their ability to somehow maintain employment in the sector and in the process appropriate for themselves the enormous amount of subsidies that went into the sector. This blackmailing had to do with the possibility of blackmailing or threatening the rest of Ukraine with the threat of, ugly miners going into Kyiv, which already happened in the 1990s, or with the threat of Donbass separatism. But it also involved the utilization of a very vertically structured industrial chain having to do with some of the technologies used for the coal metallurgical chain to support the Party of Regions and money from this chain to actually support it directly. So not only getting the vote through that vertical structure, but supporting it materially. So to close, I want to say that coal is also very important for understanding the challenges facing Ukraine today for basically two reasons. First, although since 2014 and the Russian intervention, Ukraine has been able to reduce its purchases, for example, of Russian natural gas, or at least contractually Russian natural gas. In the case of coal, it has really been a very weak link in the country's energy chain, in particular because so much of that supply chain that involved now uncontrolled territories was key for the supply of energy. The types of coal that were used, the types of factories, the types of power plants that were used to generate electricity using coal were very clearly specified for types of coal from that region. And that has actually turned from the guarantor or possible guarantor of Ukrainian energy independence that it was seen as in the early 1990s to really a very weak link in its economy. And finally, there is no possibility of talking about reintegrating currently occupied or uncontrolled territories in Eastern Ukraine without an economic perspective for those regions. And if Ukraine does not grasp what can be the way in which the coal sector, the metallurgical sector can be developed in a way that is sustainable, it will be very, very hard to bring those populations back into the nation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Margarita. You concluded, I think, on a very poignant and important point. Let me introduce now Ilona Sologu, who is the CEO and editor of Vox Ukraine, an independent research organization consisting of experienced economists and lawyers, before which she was a member of Vox Ukraine's supervisory board. She's also a management team member at the Kyiv School of Economics, which she joined in 2010 as a researcher and was later promoted to be Director of Economic Policy Research. Before that, Ilona worked in the banking sector, performing market and operational risk analysis. She's had experience developing and implementing market risk models, writing analytics on various topics, including the Ukrainian and global economies, social issues, and market research. She graduated from the EERC master's program in economics, now the Kyiv School of Economics, and was a lecturer as well at the Kyiv Mohyla Academy. Ilona, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this discussion, and also, of course, to Mikhail for arranging this very impressive book. I think it will be helpful and successful. I was involved in the production of the chapter on private sector development, and here I present just 2 slides with barriers and successes. And the more I think of it, the more I come to conclusion that a lot of these barriers to private sector development are rooted in the 2 decades of roughly 1920 to 1940, when everything related to private sector was repressed or extinguished by the state, this so-called military communism model and its developments. So although if you look at the numbers, you will see that private sector is quite well developed in Ukraine, and privatization has been a success. Like thousands of primarily state-owned enterprises or entities were sold in the middle of 1990s. Also, a lot of large enterprises were sold in 2000s. If you look deeper at that, you could see that everything that could go wrong actually went wrong. So this refers to voucher privatization. This refers to selling the assets to people whom we now call oligarchs, so people who got access to these assets, and afterwards they still continue to receive government support for their operations, despite the assets were private. So it was like privatization of profits and nationalization of losses. And the reason for that, so you could come thus to a paradox that on the one thing the state is rather weak and is not present in the private sector that much. But on the other hand, if you are close to the state, you can get a lot of preferences for your enterprise and a lot of support from the state. So it's like a complicated relationship, but there are people who know how to benefit from that. And as I show here, the corruption and underdeveloped market are, I think, consequences of the more fundamental problems, like poor understanding of economics and poor understanding also of what property rights means and what property right protection means, and underdevelopment of institutions in Ukraine. But there are also some success stories, which is small privatization. So if you're small and stay under radars, then you could be successful. There are quite a few success stories of companies that developed from scratch in Ukraine. Banking sector in the last years can be also considered a success story after the regulator introduced proper standards and enforced those standards on their banks. Agriculture, despite, of course, it received a lot of explicit and implicit subsidies in the form of low taxes, absence of land market, and so on. Still, bankers, for example, consider agricultural enterprises one of the best borrowers, and this sector is developing quite successfully, including introduction of proper management techniques. The IT sector, perhaps currently the large part of it looks like a sweatshop, so it's just working for some Western companies, but there are also success stories, and I think as this sector works with students, with the young people, and there is this startup culture develops in Ukraine. We will see more and more success stories. And also after 2014, quite a few professionals from the private sector entered the government, and they tried to introduce those practices and proper processes. There you can, of course, know about the Prozor system. You can also remember some other developments. So I think this, although right now we can, it seems that there is some rollback of the reforms, but still I think this experience that people can enter the government and do something for the country, it will stay with us and it will be used sometime in the future. So here I stop my presentation, and I'm ready for the questions.
Great, thank you so much, Ilona. We have a number of excellent questions coming in already by email, but just as a reminder, anyone else who wants to ask, email kennan@wilsoncenter.org, tweet to @Kennan Institute, or post on our Facebook page, and please include your name and affiliation. I do want to start us out though by offering my colleague Misha Minakova a comment if he'd like, or a question, and then you can kick it back to me and we'll start to go through some of the audience questions, please.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, I actually have kind of several observations and then two questions to our speakers. First of all, the book that we were working, it blended into something very important. Again, Margarita mentioned that this cooperation of scholars from two different academic cultures have been creating something very valuable also for themselves in terms of understanding how different can be the same science being, or the same research being done on the soil of United States, or a look at the result at every chapter in our book. I think it's the victory of universalist nature of the science. So I'm very glad that we came up to the moment when our book is present and it has the form that it has now. And now, closer to today's topic, when I was listening to Andriana and Margarita and to Ilona's presentations, I was keeping in mind this. I was still a student when I was reading the decision of the Cabinet of Ministers of 1994, which had a list of privatization of the companies and plants and other assets for privatization. Recently, in a publication of 2018, there was an assessment saying that this plan of approximately 22-23%. So basically, within 25 years, only a quarter of the list was privatized. And here is the question to Ilona: what was happening with what is happening with privatization today? Recently, we had a decision of Cabinet of Ministers again to relaunch the privatization in 2021. And my question is, why do we still privatizing? What happened to this old privatization list? Well, it's a provocative question, but I think it's a good pass for Ilona to respond. And then I have a question to Marguerita and Andrian. So part of the transition and the ideology behind it, it was that in the post-communist, post-totalitarian states, the public sector would actually take place. So this great distribution, bifurcation would return into Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and so on. And my question is how this division on public and private spheres have actually influenced the development of energy sector. Are today's energy sector, Ukrainian energy sector companies, like, are they private really? Are they public really? What kind of nature do they have? Thank you. I'll stop for this.
Thanks, Misha. That was great. I think I don't know if everybody had a little difficulty hearing some parts of your question, but I think the questions were clear enough. So Ilona, do you want to go first on the privatization list?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the privatization list is now much shorter than it was. For example, in 1996, if I remember correctly, alone, about 50,000 enterprises were privatized. And today we have about 3,500 state-owned companies, of which I think about 200 will remain state-owned. Why we didn't privatize these leftovers for a long time? There are different reasons. For large companies, these are clashes of the vested interests of those who wanted to privatize, other parties who wanted to have this enterprise, and those who didn't want to privatize it but wanted to have it under their control. For example, there are some companies with majority state share, but which are controlled actually by private businesses. Another thing is it relates especially to small privatization and to local governments. This is fear to do anything, because on the side of officials, because if you do something and sell the assets which you don't need, then the prosecution could come to you and say, why did you sell it for like 2,000 and not 3,000 or something like that. And until there was launch of Prozoro system, where everyone could see that you see the transparent auction and who bid it, who got this asset, they were actually afraid to act. And the third reason is that we had previously some rules that were slowing down the privatization of this especially refers to large assets, and these are rules like, for example, selling some shares on the open market, or too complicated procedures for primary evaluation of this asset, and so on. So that the government was trying hard not to sell it cheaply, but in the end, it didn't sell it at all. So this would be my answer to that.
Thanks, Ilona. And Marguerita, Andrian, who wants to go first on talking about the public versus private spheres in the energy sector? Go ahead, Marguerita, you're muted.
Thank you. Let me take a bit of a stab at this. One of the really interesting things about studying Ukraine is that it really challenges that idea that this is going to be a transition to private economy, because what we see is that Ukrainian oligarchs very soon understood that it was more beneficial for them to have an informal control of formally owned companies than to officially own them. And we see that very clearly in the coal sector, all the battles for the control of coal mines and iron ore mines and other things. It's interesting because this develop a little bit differently in different subsectors of the energy field. In the case of coal, that was very strong, let's say until around 2004, 2005. At that time, because there were foreign competitors coming in after the reprivatization of Kryvyi Rih, because there was more need for consolidation, you saw more formalization of ownership in the coal sector and in the metallurgical sector around that period, but it continued until much later, for example, in the natural gas sector. Let's only remember that incredible scene in 2015, I believe, when Ihor Kolomoisky, who was informally controlling state-owned Transnafta, tried to kind of raid and take control again of the company. So oligarchs understood that it was better to have informal control than formal control. Why? Because doing so allowed them basically to continue to receive state subsidies and transform those state subsidies into their own private capital. Some of this has changed, but some of this has remained. And in another aspect of the question, of the very interesting question raised by Mihailo, there is still a bit of an lack of clarity in Ukraine about the difference between state property and public property, which is another aspect of this issue. And this became very, very clear a year and a few months ago, as Ukraine finally had to comply with European Union regulations about the unbundling of NAK Naftogaz Ukraini, all these EU regulations that Ukraine had signed into as a member of the energy community, regulations requiring the separation between production, transmission or transit, and distribution. And until the last minute, NAK Naftogaz wanted to keep this united, or to keep control, direct control and ownership of the transmission sector. So unfortunately, I do not think that there has been a sufficient clarity about these different types of ownership in Ukraine and the number of loopholes. And I think this is something Ilona indirectly has alluded to in her presentation, and she may want to talk about more. The number of loopholes concerning corporate governance and property rights have allowed a tremendous amount of corruption in those sectors. Andrew?
Thank you. Thanks. That's a really good question. In Ukraine, government always tries to sell unprofitable company, but nobody want to buy it. And in the case of profitable companies, state prefer using these companies to take money for subsidizing like final consumers. That is also a kind of misusing. And there are also companies state-owned companies which are unprofitable but can be profitable, and these are profitable as a result of misusing by some persons, including oligarchs. Marguerita already mentioned Ihor Kolomoisky. So even now he was misusing the biggest company, thermal power producing company, and authorities couldn't change management, efficiently change management in the company. they had to use riot police twice to do this. But still, there are a lot of unprofitable companies which will never be sold and this problem should be solved. That is the case of state-owned coal mines. These state-owned coal mines produce less than 10% of all coal in the country right now, and contribute just, if I'm not wrong, 0.2% of GDP in the country. But from year to year, they're generating more and more losses. So this lack of state policy, what to do with this property, lack of political will, what to do with this property, lack of the policy of creating new clusters so that these people working in that mines could get new jobs. That brings us to many problems. However, still I believe that despite the fact that privatization of energy assets was intransparent, I believe that private owner is much more efficient than state does. So I think if there was no privatization, we would saw energy sector today in much worse condition if there was in other cases.
Thanks, guys, very much. We have some wonderful questions coming in. It looks like a lot of our questioners have lived and worked in Ukraine and are very interested in some of the things that are, striking and surprising to Westerners who show up and try to help. I actually want to take first something that really struck me when I lived in Ukraine. This is from Joyce Elferdink, who says, when I lived in Western Ukraine in 2016, every family I met had members working out of the country due to lack of local jobs. Has that improved? Boy, and amid a pandemic on top of it. Who would like to take that one?
I can answer
Please.
that question. Actually, there are no precise estimates of how many Ukrainians work abroad, but I don't think that this is something negative. Of course, it has some negative consequences for the families, but as for the general, it reduces the pressure on labor market, for example, that people work abroad. Second, they earn there some money, and often they come, especially to Western Ukraine, and start their own business in a tourist area. For example, they build private hotels or whatever. So this is not necessarily a bad thing. I think situation did not change much since the lockdown. So people who used to work abroad, I think they still do that.
If I may, I want to offer a couple of follow-ups on that question, and Misha, I welcome you to comment on this too, since it is certainly a sociological issue as well. I mean, my experience in Moldova was, of course, that the extreme version of labor migrancy can result in a massive hollowing out of a society, which is very negative. I wonder, if there are parts of, obviously Ukraine as a whole has not seen that, but if there are parts of Ukraine where that's been a problem. And then I guess the other question is, during COVID, what's happened with, I know it's a large number, for example, of Ukrainians who used to be able to drive back and forth to Poland or Hungary or, some of the neighboring countries. I mean, has this stopped because of COVID for a year? And anyway, Misha, go ahead.
Well, before the COVID, there was a process that our sociologists and demographers were calling, when the migrants had a tendency to actually stay, that they worked for a longer time. Like if a working migrant stayed in a country for over 5 years, he or she would probably try to move his or her family to the country of work. So they would have tendency to leave. And 18, the sociological polls were saying that it was a migrants.
Misha, unfortunately, we're losing you about half the time now.
Sorry for this.
Maybe if you turn off your virtual background, it will be a little more efficient. let me offer in the meantime, Marguerita, Andrian, do you want to comment on the labor migrancy issues at all? Andrian, go ahead.
Yeah, just a short comment. I think the situation hasn't changed drastically by 2021 when a pandemic, by 2020 when pandemic appeared, because every year the amount of money these people transferred from other states to Ukraine was increasing. So that I believe that there is no serious decrease of number of people who are working abroad. However, still there are some questions about the methodology, but no serious reason to believe that situation has changed seriously.
Misha, are you back?
Yes, well, let's hope that the connection is better. So basically, yes, there was an impact of COVID on those working migrants in Europe. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Maybe just.
So the labor migrants during quarantines and lockdowns, they stopped going back to Ukraine. So it creates new incentives for them to localize and to. However, the recent report by EU.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I'm sorry, Misha, we keep losing you. Marguerita, did you want to comment on this? Because I can also go to any other questions. Lots. You're muted, Marguerita.
I let it go for now.
Okay, great. So next I'll take a question here from Gunther Rosenitz, who directs the Austrian Peace Academy. He asks kind of a number of questions all combined together, but I'm just going to read it. What are Ukraine's energy goals regarding pollution and nuclear power? There are some Ukrainian water plants in the far west which are affecting Moldova. Can you explain this issue? And what could be areas of cooperation between Ukraine and the EU on, I guess, green energy? And likewise, how does that look between Ukraine and the US? So kind of a lot of questions packaged in there. Marguerita, Andrian, I think one of you ought to tackle that first if you're willing.
Maybe I'll start.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So regarding nuclear power, so nuclear is crucially important. Ukraine is responsible for more than 50% of electricity produced. So energy strategy says that Ukraine will play extremely important role to nuclear power. And except of this, there are no specific benchmarks. But now, so last year, National Nuclear Power Company, Energoatom, had losses about $5 billion, not dollars. Okay, but there was the first year when it was unprofitable, and there was still a question what money will be used to build new nuclear power units. However, as I see for next 20 years, existing power units still can be used safely. So state says that we will use nuclear power in future. Regarding hydropower plants in Moldova, that's true because there are a number of energy facilities on Dniester River, and Dniester is a crucially important source of water for Moldova. About 90% of water comes from this river. And in the case if some new facilities are constructed on Dniester, this means lowering level of water in Moldova and the scarcity of the problem of scarcity of water. So there are plans to construct new hydropower plants on Dniester, but still we are too far from implementing these plans. These facilities won't be built next year. So it's I think we will see discussions, negotiations, maybe with Moldova, with the European Union, but can see that there's a lot of clarity about future of this nuclear power plants. Regarding
Yeah, I just go ahead, Andrian, if you wanted to touch on the other questions. We'll give Margarita a chance on that as well.
Regarding pollution, so now before new climate conference, we are still discussing about the Ukrainian input in carbon pollution decreasing, and there are serious negotiations with the European Union about future application to Ukraine of carbon border taxing mechanism, and probably we will have a serious cooperation with the European Union on hydrogen, green hydrogen production, which because European hydrogen strategy plays a specific role to Ukraine as a future hydrogen exporter to European Union.
Margarita, did you want to touch further on especially the EU, Ukraine, and US, Ukraine?
I think Andrian covered most of the topics, but I do want to emphasize something very important in what he said, that is the transnational links that take place here take place at levels that sometimes we kind of neglect to see, and the example of the planned hydropower stations in the Dniester are a very, very good example of that. When we talk about energy or green energy cooperation with the EU, for example, let's not forget what is actually happening, which is that in many situations, the EU is outsourcing its high CO2 emission energy consumption through importation from Ukraine. We have in Ukraine, or there is in Ukraine, two areas, two so-called energy islands in Western Ukraine that are exporting electricity to the EU, coal-based electricity. So even before we talk about green cooperation, we need to look at the ways in which highly polluting production is being kind of outsourced through Ukraine in these ways. And I think that's also an element of the picture that needs to be considered.
Let me go to another question now from Elena Lenin, who's an adjunct professor at the University of New Haven, also a former Kennan Institute fellow. She asks you, Margarita, directly the following: as you know, not all coal is the same. Most of Ukraine's anthracite coal, which is considered cleaner, is produced in uncontrolled areas of Donbass. And since Kiev's blockade in 2017, millions of tons have been shipped to Russia, where it is relabeled as Russian and sold to Asia and Europe. That's just one example of lost profit for Ukraine on resources smuggled out of the so-called republics. What's your opinion on this economic blockade? What can Ukraine and the international community do to prevent a complete collapse of Donbass's economy and the toll it will take on local populations? Obviously, that becomes quite a large question, but go ahead if you'd like to comment.
Well, first of all, I welcome this question, and I think it shows a very nuanced understanding of the sets of issues going on there. So the issue of the blockade takes us back to the issue of how Ukrainian coal-related oligarchs were continuing very close connections with those uncontrolled or Russian-occupied territories until 2017, even when there was officially a separation and a policy of non-cooperation in that sector. Of course, this raises also the issue of how to prevent the economic collapse of Donbass. And this is a very big question because it raises the issue of what is the responsibility of the de facto occupying power there, and what is the responsibility of Kyiv there. And it's an issue that touches not only upon energy issues, but also issues of pensions, issues of social services, issues of whether pensioners from those areas should be allowed to receive their pensions from Ukraine, whether Ukraine should actually force Russia to take responsibility for those areas. And I don't think we can fully discuss that in five minutes or 10 minutes. But what is clear to me here is that as dysfunctional in efficiency terms and in long-term terms as the coal metallurgical sector was in that area before 2014, what we have now is not only the dissolution of the links with the rest of Ukraine, but a horrific situation there for the workers of the sector, total lack of workers' rights in the mines, in the uncontrolled territories, and a lot of mines that had been flooded with water. So these are very, very serious issues. What can Ukraine do, or what should Ukraine do to stop this, is also a political question, which I think is a matter of what policies are pursued, whether to try to keep or support maintaining those territories afloat, or to force Russia to live up to what it has done in the region. The only thing I want to add is that Ukrainian oligarchs know this very well, and they are making sure that they maintain a presence even after 2017 in the area through their social service foundations and so on. And it's a very touchy political question, and I would love to hear what Mihailo has to say about this, for example. Thank you.
Well, Misha, if you want to try again, you've been called out.
I'm afraid my connection is getting worse. It's something going on outside in the weather. Sorry for this.
Oh, okay, no problem. We actually have a number of other questions. So with your permission, Andrian and Ilona, maybe you can tackle this one. David Darby is a former U.S. Treasury Department and USAID advisor working with the Ukrainian government. And he worked on improving the budget system for the country. He asks, do any of the panelists have impressions about how Ukraine's budget, finances, and overall fiscal policy are working today? Ilona, would you take a stab at that? I feel like.
Yes, so I would say that the fiscal system is working okay. So in I think 2019 and before that, there were a few changes to legislation that, for example, with introduction of some fiscal rules, or there were some legislative grounds for introduction of 3-year budgeting and so on. So like basically there is the legislation for that, but we need to see, of course, the implementation of this new developments in the budgeting. So I wouldn't say that it's as bad as it was like before 2014, but it's obviously not perfect because many government institutions do not yet understand what program budgeting is. I mean, proper program budgeting, that you need to achieve some policy goal with your budget and so on. They are used to this line budgeting and try to keep it as long as possible. But there is some slow progress. For example, a review of expenditures has started and has been completed in a few ministries or government agencies. So we hope that with time this will improve. And of course, the cooperation with the IMF is important in this respect. So this is like an external incentive to keep the budget deficit within reasonable limits.
You know, you mentioned the IMF, Ilona, and Andrian, I'll come to you as well, if that's all right. My impression is that repayment of international debt is actually a huge percentage of the Ukrainian state budget. I know it varies from year to year, but you know, if that's correct, is this kind of like a 1 step forward, 2 steps back kind of problem where you know, all of the things that Ukraine tries to do with its budget gets crowded out by this, you know, kind of debt burden?
Well, actually, that's true. The debt burden is increasing. However, so this year it will be not a problem to pay for debts because these amounts are not so extraordinary. And in case of IMF, it's more about trust, because if there is no agreement on IMF tranche, then like other parties may doubt about Ukrainian reliability, and this impact on profitability of the bonds that Ukraine issue to finance either payments or some other programs.
Well, I would say the situation with state debt is not as bad as it was in 2016, when it was about 80% to GDP. Now it's about 60%, and a year, and in 2019 it declined to 50%. But the main thing is to be able to refinance this debt, and of course the price which you pay for it. And everyone knows that IMF money is cheap, and money on the market, taking into account the country risk, is more expensive.
Okay, let me go to one more audience question from Günter Rosenitz, the director of the Austrian Peace Academy, who asks, he suggests he has doubts about Ukraine's ability to organize the economy, given the challenges of corruption, rule of law, the security situation, etc., and asks in particular about the dependency on external supporters, in particular the United States and China. I remember, this is me talking, I remember in my time living in Ukraine and doing research, this was in the very late Yanukovych period, that you would always have this kind of specter of, well, you know, if it doesn't work out in the Russian vector or the Western vector, we always can go to the Chinese. And so I am very interested in that question. Ukraine doesn't seem to have a major dependency on China. Is there development in that direction, and kind of how does it balance?
Well, I would say that Ukraine tries to be friends with everyone as much as it is possible. And as for cooperation with China, it lacks some important component in that China doesn't ask for structural reforms. Yeah, of course, we have some projects financed by China in Ukraine, but I think that cooperation with international organizations like the IMF or the Western governments is more important for the institutional development of Ukraine.
And just to add about China, the most recent developments, can you hear me well? The most recent developments regarding big company Motor Sich, which are producing vehicles for helicopters and missiles, and so Chinese investor was buying this company. However, there was serious discussions in Ukraine, and there was some tensions with US, because US persuaded Ukraine not to sell Motor Sich. So at final extent, there was a decision on nationalization, and there were sanctions imposed regarding US investor. So that's very interesting how Ukraine-Chinese relations will develop in the nearest future. And the question, how will this impact on Ukraine-China international trade? Because export to China was increasing in recent years. So that's going to be very interesting development in Ukraine-China relationship.
If I can, I'd like to ask, maybe as a kind of concluding topic, a question about my own work. Again, this goes back to before the Maidan, but my perception was the situation really didn't change dramatically, and this is around the problem of raiderstvo, or raiding in Ukraine, where essentially what it has most of all to do with is the battling among different sources of power. And the fact that, ironically in Russia, you used to have huge problems with raiding, and then Putin established a power vertical, And basically the problems were reduced because it was clear who you went to validate your control over particular assets. In Ukraine, the fact of the pluralism of power actually created more opportunities for raiding. And this was true under Yanukovych. As I understand, it remains true today. I'm very interested. I haven't paid close attention to the latest developments. Are you still seeing prominent cases of raiding or what is being called raiding? Is it the same actors as always? Are there new people who come in? For example, we have now the Zelensky family, if you will. Are you seeing kind of raiding activity happening under this banner or umbrella? I'd be very curious how you assess this landscape.
I want to say just a couple of words before I leave it to the people who actually know what is happening in that area. But I would say that what is at the core here is, are there going to be transparent regulations about corporate governance? Because what I have seen through analyzing the raiding in the past is that you have actors who are raiding against each other, and tomorrow they are the same actors coalescing with each other cooperating with each other to take over a state-owned asset for pennies. So even more than the act of the raiding itself, I want to see how legislation is changing to make corporate governance more transparent, so that these kinds of things are not allowed to take away people's ownership or what people pay for with their taxes. But I think Andrea and Ilona know much more about what is happening with raiding now, and it's a really fantastic question.
Yeah, but a good point, Margarita, about the transparency issues. I will simply note that, when I was working on this, it was at the point when I think paper records were transitioning to electronic records. And so another question you could add is, you probably remember the notarius played a critical role, because you had paper records and stampa and everything. If you could go and get a corrupt notarius to help you, then anything was possible. Now, as you have more transparency and more electronic records, I wonder if we intersect with the world of cybercrime also in this problem. Anyway, lots of questions. I'm curious of your takes, Andrea and Ilona, and Misha, if you want to try.
Well, the problem that you described was all these notarius was changing documents. This still exists. So these crimes still are popular. Especially, it's about stealing property and stealing lands. And so I haven't met any specific, index that measures these things. But I believe that nowadays, this raiding problem is much lower than it was like 7 years ago, when it was under the umbrella of big people, big politicians like Yanukovych was, and they were trying to raid businesses of other people in the interest of Yanukovych's son. So these problems still exist, but I believe that in smaller scale than it was. And I just recommend you to read the article I published half a year ago, I believe, why Ukrainian prosecution system remains toothless. And this gives a lot of answers to why these problems still exist.
Ilona, please.
I'm not very familiar with this problem, but what I see from the news, there is not much discussion of raidership. So probably people are finding some easier ways to earn money if they want them to grasp some others' property. And of course, electronic registers help, although there was recently a discussion that state land, some of the state land disappeared somehow from the state ownership. As for the corporate governance rights. There were some changes in regulation in 2015 and 2016 that actually even moved Ukraine a little bit up in the doing business rating, but I don't know how they are applied in practice. So you need to talk to the entrepreneurs to know that. But the improvements in corporate governance were actually there in the legislation.
And I'd add, you know, it was true at that time, 6-7 years ago, and I suspect it's true today that, you know, rating is not always created equal. Sometimes you have a business dispute. I mean, just a sort of normal argument, which, you know, each side accuses the other side of rating because they know it's kind of a black mark and it makes good PR. Misha, did you want to try to offer a final comment?
Yes, if you can hear me.
Yes.
This storm outside, it probably ruins the connection. Sorry for this. Well, Ilona and Adriana are right. There was no much reports in mass media about the raidership attacks recently. And the famous raiders, they look like they are retired from that type of business into more solid type of business. So you can see this family of famous raiders in Dnipropetrovsk, for example. They are now doing other type of business. And about a year ago, I interviewed one of the lawyers who was involved in many litigations connected to corporate raidership. And he was saying that this type of business is disappearing for some unexpected reason, that there was, due to the judiciary reform, courts are less, there are less judges in the courts right now. There's a big lack of judges in the courts of justice. And for this reason, you cannot make many fast decisions in the court. And raidership really needs this fast decision. Plus, in addition, we have this registry, electronic registry, and every decision is there timely marked. So basically, the potential victims can trace very fast the attack. So in a way, this type of business is probably disappearing. At the same time, the new risk emerges that in recent several months, we see a lot of sanctions against oligarchs. And it creates certain opportunities for non-judiciary path of raidership. So there's, for example, a case right now with a pipeline that is being taken away from, allegedly from Medvedchuk or his family members. And here we are entering into the situation that creates a possibility for someone else who has an opportunity to take it over. But again, there's no report so far on this kind of events. But yes, there's a new opportunity appearing for raidership.
Well, these are all great points, and the issues remain fascinating. I loved your reference, Misha, to the Dnipro raider clans, because they were in fact quite famous. In fact, there was a certain oligarch whose name I won't mention, except to say that his first name was Ihor and his moniker was Ihor 1%. And I don't know if that still applies, but I remember saying at the time to many of my Ukrainian interview subjects that, well, you know, we had these people in the United States also, and now they're legitimate. And at the time I worked for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. So there was a great irony there, as Andrew Carnegie certainly did some interesting things in acquiring his fortune. Look, I want to thank everybody very much. It's been a great discussion. We covered a lot of ground. Let me encourage anyone listening, pick up a copy of the book. It will be available on the website. I think you can pre-order it now and it'll be available in May. We'll do probably more events highlighting the different chapter authors. I want to thank Marguerita, Ilona, Andrian for your contributions to the volume, for your contributions today. Misha, thank you so much for being the driving force behind the project. I'm glad your internet is working again. Where there's internet, there is life. So thank you again to all of my colleagues, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thank you. Goodbye.